Then if not, then we can go to our next speaker, which is Pip McDonald, and she is a learning technologist at the Royal Agricultural Society. She's currently working on technology-enhanced transnational learning projects with China and higher education. Previously, she has taught English for academic purposes and has worked in a university language center in technical capacity. She also is involved with both internet radio and podcasting. Her Twitter handle is PipMac6. And I can hand it off to you, Dr. McDonald.
Okay, one moment. I'll just share my screen. Can you see my screen?
Yes,
okay?
We can see it.
Perfect. Okay, I'll make a start. So hello, everybody. Thank you very much for the introduction, Christine. My name is Pip McDonald, and I'm a learning technologist, and I'd like to present the transnational education perspective from a learning technologist point of view. And in terms of development, the development of a toolkit, a technology-enhanced transnational learning toolkit. So let me introduce you to the Royal Agricultural University. We are, I think, one of the smallest universities in the UK, based in Cirencester, and we take a lead on agricultural education. We're small scale, so we've got about approximately 1,000 students, both in an undergraduate and a postgraduate capacity. So the curriculum areas and the courses include things like agribusiness, rural land management, farming and entrepreneurship. And we're very much embedded in the land-based sector for about 175 years. We've got some other interesting technology-enhanced spaces. For example, we have a place called Farm 491, which is a place for technology-enhanced agriculture, and we've just got a new Cultural Heritage Institute. Okay, so in terms of our transnational partnerships, the RAU itself has two main institutions with whom we partner in a transnational capacity, and they are firstly Shandong Agricultural University and secondly Qingdao Agricultural University. So we call them SDAU and QAU for short. So one of the most significant physical features of near Shandong University for the teachers who've gone over there to teach in a face-to-face capacity is the wonderful Mount Tai, and some of the Zoom backgrounds that our teachers use are of this wonderful mountain. We also have some significant English for academic purposes provision there as well. And over the other side, we have Qingdao Agricultural University, which is a public university. And we have a joint institute very much like this of advanced agri-technology supported by the Ministry of Education in China. And we offer, and through that, we offer double awards in an undergraduate capacity. So it's things like agriculture, environment, food production, and international business. So this is for Chinese nationals only in China, and we also offer some EAP provision as well to that end. There is also hope that there will be some mobility when the pandemic restrictions are lifted in a more global capacity to increase student mobility in between our institutions. So in terms of the pivot journey for both institutions and the transnational projects around that, they were very much different for each university. So for Shandong Agricultural University, it was very much a pandemagogy project. So by that, I mean, it was very much emergency pedagogy. And it's interesting how these new terms seem to evolve, in addition to Zoom being an incidental, an unintended pedagogical tool. So the pandemagogy had two parts. So very much similar to what we've just heard about using pre-recorded lectures in Panopto, which has a very good integration with a lot of virtual learning environments such as such as Moodle. And then the second part was using Zoom to deliver interactive sessions. So I think someone's just talked about the whiteboard, and that obviously needs a lot of practice and staff training and input to improve digital capabilities. So there were two main parts to that. So there's a pre-recorded lectures and the Zoom interactive sessions. So there's a kind of synchronous and asynchronous element. We also carried out attendance monitoring in Zoom. So that's actually quite easy to do. Just by downloading some reports and making sure you can make sense of the data in Excel. So these were largely food and real estate modules, approximately 150 students per online class. So that's quite a significant pedagogical challenge as a teacher to engage 150 students in one Zoom class. So usually our academic teaching staff fly over to Shandong University and deliver in person in a face-to-face capacity. So they already had that relationship from which to build an online relationship, given that learning is all about relationships. So it was very much a pivot project. So we had 2 successful cohorts in summer of last year in 2020, and then a winter program, and we've got another 3 cohorts planned where online pivot will be very much in practice. So moving to the other university, Qingdao Agricultural University, this is a completely different project. It's actually a lot bigger. And one of the core outputs of this project will be to develop a global VLE that could be used around the world to deliver transnational projects in addition to the China provision. So this will include things, very unique curriculum areas such as soil, environmental science, food production, and very much agri-food industry focused. So the VLE will be in addition to our own VLE, which is called Gateway based, which is Moodle. And this is very much a work in progress, and it's very much a bigger project than the Shandong University project, because we kind of knew what tools we were going to use. So this is very much new territory for us. So going back to what I said I would discuss, which is this idea of a toolkit. Hang on a minute, sorry, my screen has just frozen. One moment, I'm trying to okay, sorry about that. So, you know, what is this toolkit, this idea of a toolkit? Who uses a toolkit? What's the purpose of a toolkit? So sometimes when we think about people who carry a toolbox, we think actually it's someone that's going to fix something. Well, transnational education isn't broken, but it's kind of always evolving. So it's in that really interesting space between not being broken, but also having work that needs doing on it. So interestingly enough, I decided to ask Alexa, you know, what is a toolkit, please? Can I have a working definition of a toolkit? And this is what she said.
The noun toolkit can have a couple meanings. 1, an assembly of tools. 2, a set of basic components for developing software.
Well, that sounded about right to me, and it sounded like a good starting point, a kind of foundation document, a collaborative document from which you can sort of think about different dimensions of practice. And then also, because I'd asked Alexa, I wondered to what extent AI would have an input into the future of transnational education. I think that's another theme for another conference for another time. So let's move on. So it feels like a big part of the toolkit that we wanted to deliver was working with uncertainty. The uncertainty of working in transnational education, not being totally sure whether the tools that we were using were actually available. So we had to make sure that they weren't going to be blocked, or we had to develop very much a plan B and a plan C. So if Zoom doesn't work, does Teams work? Is there a limit on how many participants we can have? So it was really sort of about being conscious about working with uncertainty and embracing uncertainty. It was very much also in acknowledgement of the fact that a toolkit isn't a blueprint. So it might not work for one institution, but it might work for another institution. So it's very much about creating your own hyperlocal almost toolkit. And there may be other micro toolkits within a toolkit or a meta toolkit. And it's very much, I think, a collaborative activity. Right, so I had a little look around at what other toolkits were available. And Advanced HE had actually created their own transnational toolkit. And it was really interesting to see that this had been created, and it's perhaps not unexpected due to the rapid expansion of transnational education. And it seemed really important. Their rationale for creating it was things like quality assurance, the logistics of transnational education, which we saw in the last presentation was quite difficult to manage, and we kind of have to be reactive and responsive to that. So this toolkit was actually created by Dr. Karen Smith from the University of Hertfordshire, and she created a really interesting taxonomy of modes of delivery of transnational education. And she had a kind of corresponding scenario next to the mode. So for example, mode 1 is about program mobility. So that would be where essentially distance learning, where, you know, for example, the Open University has been doing that really successfully for a number of years. So mode 2 is student mobility, where actually the students make the move. And there's kind of a temporary student mobility with things like the former Erasmus scheme. Then we have mode 3, which is like institutional mobility. So universities supply education to students in their own countries with an in-country service provider. And then the final one, mode 4, is about staff mobility, where very much a case of staff being sent over to different universities to deliver in the country. So that was very much where our Shandong University, Agricultural University project sat. And it's interesting to see, well, actually, perhaps institutions don't fit neatly into those categories, and that's fine, because you can kind of sit in between the modes and draw the benefits of each mode, but also being mindful of the challenges of not perhaps sitting neatly within those modes. So there's this kind of transmodalness about TNE. A generic toolkit could act as then a kind of starting point. But again, I want to stress that perhaps you kind of need to build your own iteration based on the structure of a pre-existing toolkit. And now I just wanted to reintroduce myself a bit, really, because I think learning technologists who work in a transnational capacity are a little bit like digital construction workers in terms of the fact we create and contribute to the digital architecture and the digital infrastructure that supports transnational pedagogy. So it's almost, particularly when you sort of think about the language we use with a joint institute, it's almost like a digital co-construction worker. So it's interesting how transnational education transforms our identities, particularly through the catalyst of, say, a pivot. I mean, I don't know how many learning technologists you know that wear hard hats, but perhaps that's a bad joke. Ralph Waldo Emerson is supposed to have said, I used to work at the University Language Centre and taught EAP, and Ralph Waldo Emerson was supposed to have said that language is like fossil poetry. And in a way, I think learning technologists who work in this way create kind of digital fossils. So we're kind of creating this footprint, and this footprint can be used to help support other people and build a toolkit. It's almost like we're creating transnational digital architecture through practice, even without realizing it. Now, okay, I'm going to talk about a couple of the dimensions of practice that I feel were really important to the emerging toolkit for our Royal Agricultural University. Now, first of all, research-informed practice. Now, I feel like transnational education with a learning technology focus is quite a unique area, and I feel quite privileged as a learning technologist to be working with that kind of niche area. So it felt important to carry out a lot of action research on the ground. So after each cohort, we had an evaluation for staff, part of the staff who were actually teaching in real time. So one of the outputs of that was for the University of East London Learning and Teaching Symposium that took place in September 2020. It was a case study, and it was a research poster exploring the impact of the transnational online pivot. And what was really interesting, one of the core outcomes of that, which was very interesting, is that the staff felt that actually what was happening was more multimodal learning. So you think about Zoom as a platform, I guess it is a multimodal learning platform. You think about the whiteboard and lots of modes of delivery. That was really interesting. The other interesting output from that research project was actually that there were two main things that really worried staff who were teaching in this kind of pivot context, which was firstly their internet connection, which we can all relate to. So that is a kind of universal problem that caused them a lot of anxiety. And then also class management. So online class management, how do we manage that? Is it different or is it similar to working in real time on the ground in a face-to-face capacity? So the online classroom itself is quite interesting, how we exist, how students exist online. It's a bit strange and a bit haunting in a way. The ontology of existing in your box in Zoom is a very strange pedagogical reality, and it's almost a bit spooky in a sense. So one of the other main research outputs to kind of really hammer this this dimension of the toolkit home for research-informed practice was the University of Manchester China HE 2020 conference. So that was all about navigating uncertain futures. So coming back to this idea of uncertainty and working in a transnational capacity, not as a negative thing, but actually something we have to embrace. You kind of have to dive into the ocean of uncertainty with transnational work, and it kind of becomes part of your identity. So we created this taxonomy of uncertainty. So the staff who were teaching online, there were sort of broad categories that they experienced this uncertainty. So for example, pedagogy, tool-based anxiety, location-based anxiety. So we developed this idea of uncertainty literacy, which is very much part, I think, of working in a transnational way. We asked them some quite bold questions to staff. We asked them, did moving to online learning cause you uncertainty? And it was unequivocally 100% yes. And they started to sort of, what was emerging from this research was that actually they're accepting it as part of their identity, and it's part of whatever this new normal would be. We wanted to drill down a bit more pedagogically with research-informed practice to this idea of polling. So we talked, I think, earlier about someone using Angry Birds. And what's going on there? So we tried to gamify a little bit and use polling. So Zoom has a pre-existing functionality for polling. We also use this other tool called VVox, which is really good because it integrates with a lot of pre-existing VLEs. And we wanted to figure out whether the student engagement was increased, or the student experience was increased by getting students en masse, 150 students, to start polling. And what we found is that actually, yes, 479 students responded to this online question, and they actually, the overwhelming feeling was that actually, yes, polling is good because you're engaging a large amount of people and you can use it in a formative way or even in a summative way. So this is this idea of what Blake, Gillen and Thorne call this brave new digital classroom. You have to kind of, transnational pivots involve this kind of bravery. We then very quickly moved on to the University of Kent digitally enhanced webinars, where we explore this idea of the transnational online classroom being a bit of an adventure. So a learning technologist could be like a digital archaeologist. So this is emerging idea of having fun with a bit of metaphor. So metaphor in higher education is a really powerful tool to get us to think about things in different ways. The other dimension that I'd like to draw your attention to is the Royal Agricultural University's digital transformation blog. So as part of this, we had a China series of blogs. So it wasn't just one person's perspective. What we did, the approach we took, our partners in China, we have two very good colleagues in China called Bonnie and Lola, and we invited our colleagues from China to actually write some of their reflections on working with us. So it wasn't just a kind of one voice being represented in a collaborative blog. The other thing I was very keen to do is invite one of our academics who taught both in China and online to write a collaborative blog with me, so to capture his expectations, his reflections of teaching in both realities. That was really powerful. So Louise Drum, in an article, talks about this idea of folk pedagogy, so that the ideas that teaching staff have about moving to online learning. So very interesting to sort of tease out what people actually think about online learning. So that was a really powerful tool. Now, something that should be in everybody's toolkit for any online approach should be digital accessibility. It's an interesting topic. We in England, we have to provide, for example, captions with our Panopto videos. I don't know if other institutions, how you've actually been able to manage this, but caption accuracy is an ongoing problem. With automatic captions, you might not get the correct words. And if you're sending those lectures over to China without the right words, does that have an impact on the student experience? And so we want to get caption accuracy as high as possible, but then you have to think about increasing your budget for transnational projects to make sure the captions are right. So there's lots of things to think about. The other thing I'd like to draw your attention to for any sort of toolkit, not necessarily transnational, but it's really important for transnational, is the power of testing and demo sites. So for our project with Qingdao University, we're creating a new VLE for that project. It's really important to create a test site so you can identify all the the plugins that you want to use. I think academic integrity was mentioned in the last presentation. So what kind of tools can we use for that? Can we use things like Turnitin? And does Turnitin work in China? So we need to create this test site to give to our colleagues in China to make sure it works in China. What is their experience? What's their experience logging in as a student, a teacher, an admin? All of these things to think about. Then we also need to, before we say go out to tender for something like this, we also need to come up with a series of needs. We need to be really clear about what we need this VLE to do and perform. What is performing in a transnational context looking like? Can we get another internet connection? So I'm aware that JISC do a lot of work on this internet connection, working with Alibaba. The other thing to be aware of is a really good thing for testing and demo sites is the power of the pilot. The power of the pilot program. So if you want a proof of concept, it's really good to kind of justify the next stages of the project. So it's almost like saying a toolkit is about project management. As un-Hollywood as that sound, it's about project management and thinking about each user. The other thing that's really important, I think someone in the questions talked about, for the last presentation, talked about how using whiteboard for the first time was a disaster. It's always going to be a disaster the first time. So you've got to allow staff to have a bit of a play about, create a test site or a sandbox site where it's safe for them to make a mistake. And then build up their confidence, build up the digital capability. I am absolutely proud of our lecturers because they're in such a great position now compared to last year in terms of their digital capability. So one other thing is it's not just about learning technologists, transnational working. It's not just about teachers either. There's all sorts of players, and there's people in registry, student records, student administration, digital innovation, in both partner universities. So what I did was I asked some of our staff a couple of questions about what they would put into a toolkit for transnational working based on their core area. So one of the questions was, what have you learned about working in a transnational capacity in your area or function? And I'll read out one of the responses. It's really interesting. So the response was, there are so many moving parts and it can be a challenge to stay on track. Having singular focused working groups that focus on key areas is good for the workflow to meet targets and avoid missing priorities. So the core thing I wanted to focus on there is this idea of a working group. So for a lot of the transnational work that we did, we had one working group per institution. So it became really obvious that working groups, we need to expand the working group or invite extra people to become members or develop subgroups with specific interests. So don't be frightened of saying, right, we need a learning technology focus group, we need a registry focus group. As long as they come together and they communicate, it's a really good way of tackling transnational work. I also said, if you could put one thing into a transnational online learning toolkit, what would it be and why? One of the responses was to integrate Microsoft Planner into the toolkit, if possible, which streamlines the project management. Okay, I don't know if you've seen Planner, but you can integrate it into Teams. It's a really clear and intuitive tool to manage a lot of these things, and you can see quite clearly who's doing what and when. The final question is, what advice would you give to a university who is working in a higher education context with China? The response was, learn from others who have gone through the process before you. So we don't have to reinvent the digital wheel here. I guess this is a purpose. One of the core purposes of the Joint Institute is to share best practice. And I've definitely done that from the past couple of sessions that I've attended. Whilst not everything will be neatly signed, sealed and digitally delivered, nothing's ever going to be perfect. It's work in progress. We keep needing to oil the cogs and the wheels, revisit the toolkit, improve and iterate. And as I said, the toolkit is not a blueprint, and you might have to abandon it temporarily and move with the times. It's not perfect for everyone, but it could be a platform to start things at. So I'd just like to finish, I'm sorry I've gone over, I'd just like to finish on something completely different, which is a little bit of a poem actually, which I adapted from an organization called Education to the Core on social media. So this is, just listen as you are. So I will teach you in a room I will teach you now in Zoom. I will teach you in your house, and I will teach you with a mouse. I will teach you here and there, and I will teach you because I care. So just do your very best, and your teacher will take care of the rest. Transnational adventures and what may come, just enjoy the journey. The learning will be done. A toolkit can help for part of the way. We all have our parts, all to play. The Lao Shi Shui Sheng, we are all learning, but let's keep the transnational fires burning. So thank you very much. That was my presentation. I hope you can maybe explore the idea of a toolkit in your own institutions. As I said, my Twitter handle is @pipmac6, or you can contact me on email, pip.mcdonald@rau.ac.uk. And thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much for the talk. Very interesting. Does anyone have any questions for Dr. Pip McDonald then?
I don't have my PhD. I'd love to be a doctor, but I'm really not. Sorry. Feel free to keep calling me that.
Okay. Oh, someone asked in the chat, thanks for sharing the poem. Can you give us the link?
I'll try. I adapted it. It's from an organization called Education to the Core, and it was posted on the 8th of April 2020 on Facebook. So you might be able to get it from that if you are on Facebook, but I did adapt it slightly.
I think Facebook is also blocked in China.
No, if there's interest, I could try and find the link or copy and paste the text into the chat.
Oh, that can work too, yeah.
I think there's a bit of discussion in the chat of what technology is best for things like screen captioning and things like that. And I think it's something that you also talked about, Pip. It's a back and forth between finding things that work, but then also making sure that they're not currently blocked in China, and sort of finding a compromise between basically what's convenient and what's, I think, possible. So it's really,
yeah, there's that. It's exactly what you've said. It's convenience and possibility, and also I think it's why you need to have really good communication with your partners, and because they also have recommendations of tools that they use. So, for example, I think Qingdao used a VLE called Superstar, which we'd never heard of here because we're only really aware of things like Moodle and Blackboard and Canvas, and then some bespoke VLEs, but we didn't know about that. And then from a conversation from that, we realized that actually Superstar could help us with the attendance monitoring. So it's really good to find out what's convenient for both parties, because and then keyword compromise. Yeah. Do we have any
questions?
Any more?
Superstar sounds interesting. It says, oh, Duncan Rumor.
Yeah, Pip, you mentioned you do attendance monitoring on Moodle, is it?
We actually use Zoom for Shandong, but we experimented with a Moodle plugin for attendance in the demo site, I think last week, and it was actually very good because it had a kind of QR code where students could self-attend, and it wasn't like they could share the QR code with their friends, because it would regenerate itself and change each sort of 30 seconds, and there was a lot of customizable features as well. So so if you wanted to say students maybe had a doctor's appointment, couldn't attend, so there was a lot of quite good personalized opportunities for a personalized experience, and it really sort of expanded my notion of what attendance monitoring actually is, and what's the purpose of it, and is it to make sure that we don't have to, is it about student retention, is it about engagement? Yeah, so we use Zoom's used for Shandong, and then we're probably going to use QAU's pre-existing Superstar app for students for their attendance for that project.
No, thank you. I mean, we have a problem with attendance in China. We have a problem with attendance even when we're there. And one of the issues that we're worried about for remote teaching is appeals. And frankly, if you don't turn up to the lectures and you appeal, you're not going to get a terribly sympathetic hearing. So it's a sort of QA process that we're worried about.
One of the ways that we try to encourage attendance, I suppose, was, I don't know if this is true, but it could be argued to be the case, is to have attendance as part of the assessment. So that's a whole debate in itself about whether attendance should be an assessment. But I think there is a percentage of attendance that has to be in place for a student to get some sort of mark for one of the projects one way, but I'm not really sure to what extent that's effective. I'm not quite sure what I feel about it, but that's one of the approaches that has been tried.
In engineering, that is forbidden by our accreditors. We are not allowed to award marks for turning up. It's difficult. I understand why it's been done. But we've actually had to push back in our partner institutions who have done that, and we say, look, sorry guys, you can't do that. You can't award marks for turning up.
It is a bit strange, isn't it?
Whether they should have to turn up, or is it down to the student choice? But it's
But yeah, I mean, that's a presentation or a conference theme in itself, isn't it? There's so much around that about how can we prove that someone's learned something, and is attendance a prerequisite for learning? And it's about, I suppose it's about an institution's definition of learning. Yeah, I mean, I can remember as an undergraduate, I sometimes didn't attend seminars, and I chose seminars that I was going to attend strategically. But does that mean I didn't learn? I don't know.
John Mayer says in the chat, for some cases, I considered using link access data. I check when students have accessed certain links on Blackboard tabs. This can highlight engagement at least.
Yeah, you could use, there are a variety of reports available on Moodle to look at that. And it's just about deciding what student engagement is and what it isn't, and whether student engagement, how student engagement is related to learning. And those are difficult pedagogical questions for each and every institution. They're perennial.
They are. Then Melanie, you had a question? Or Duncan, your hand's still raised. Sorry.
Sorry, no, I'll take my hand down.
Okay.
See, legacy hand.
Legacy hand. I found it very interesting, Pip, that you referred to the online learning experience as spooky, because this is something that I've joked about. I had a few tutorials earlier this semester with the class that I didn't know, where I hadn't met the students yet. And they were all in one room with one sort of roving microphone, but I couldn't see them. I could only hear them if they came to the microphone. So most of it was spent me just like talking into the void and going, hello, is anybody there? Who am I talking to? And it felt like a seance, right? And so I was wondering if you could elaborate a bit more on what you mean.
Yes, sure. I came across this idea of online learning being a bit spooky in the Association for Learning Technologists winter conference, and there was a presentation delivered about this idea of this spectral experience of talking into the void, exactly what you've said, and I think they used this idea of hauntology, so from ontology to hauntology, and it was based on I think a thesis that was published previously. I can't quite remember the author, but if you sort of Google the Association for Learning Technologists winter conference, and I think that presentation should come up quite easily. But yeah, it's just this idea of how we exist, and virtual presence. I find that very interesting, how we exist online. And then what are we doing when we're online? So the research project I carried out into polling was called I Poll, Therefore I Am, drawing on the famous Cartesian phrase. So, which is problematic in itself, because if we're saying that if students are polling, therefore they exist, well, if they're not polling, then what are they doing? They don't exist.
Well, that's not, I mean, logically.
Well, it's silly.
That, no, but like A therefore B isn't the same as
Exactly.
B therefore A, but yeah.
Absolutely.
But
yes.
yeah. Oh, that's very interesting. I'll look up that that session on hauntology.
Hauntology.
Thank you.
There's a comment in the chat from Lori. She said, we use Microsoft Teams, which has just started sending us an attendance report after class.
Mm-hmm.
This is alongside Blackboard, where we closely monitor participation on the discussion board and track access.
Yeah, I think Teams has significantly improved over the course of 2020, 2021, and it's definitely something that we identified as the plan B instead of Zoom, and a platform that our lecturers are currently using for provision, non-transnational provision. So yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of good things. One of the really good tools, Microsoft Learning Tools, is to go back to the digital accessibility discussion, is the Immersive Reader. And it's really good for EAP as well, because it highlights the nouns, verbs and adjectives, in addition to sort of changing the colours in the background and the syllables and the spacing, and the read aloud features are fabulous. There's also a really good picture dictionary. So you can kind of hover over a word and then the image comes up. So it's like multimodal approach to digital accessibility, which is, I think, very helpful when English isn't your first language.
Well, I had no idea it had that many features.
It's cool.
That's in Teams, you said?
I don't know if you can get it embedded into Teams, but it's available on O365. So you can get it in Word, OneNote, I think in Outlook, in one of the browsers, Edge, I think. It improves and iterates all the time.
What is it called again?
Immersive Reader.
Immersive Reader. Okay, I see.
Who wouldn't want to read immersively? I think it was possibly ahead of its time. I discovered it a couple of years ago, and it's just improved so much. And a lot of the digital accessibility features now, so things like we've got something called Browse Aloud, which does very similar things on our VLE. They share a lot of the common kind of functionalities in terms of digital accessibility, like reading aloud, and contrast tools as well.
Wow, I think I might look that up. That sounds very nice.
It's cool.
Are there any more questions for Dr. Pip McDonald?
Maybe we could go to Professor this next.
Okay, then thank you again.